The music teacher made Ace Frehley stand in front of the entire class while she systematically destroyed his dream of becoming a guitarist. What happened next would change rock and roll history forever. It was a cold November morning in 1966 at DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, New York. 15-year-old Paul Daniel Frehley, who everyone called Ace, sat slouched in the third row of Mrs. Dorothy Kleinman's music appreciation class, his beaten-up notebook covered with hand-drawn Gibson Les Paul sketches and lightning bolts. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that institutional yellow glow that made everything look tired and sick. Ace had been trying to stay invisible all semester, which wasn't easy when you were the kid who showed up late every day smelling like cigarettes, with paint-stained jeans and hair that was just a little too long for 1966 standards. Mrs. Kleinman had been teaching at DeWitt Clinton for 23 years, and she ran her classroom like a classical music conservatory. She believed in discipline, proper technique, and most importantly, she believed that rock and roll was destroying real musical appreciation, and she especially had no patience for Paul Frehley. Ace had made his first mistake 3 weeks earlier when Mrs. Kleinman asked if anyone played an instrument. Without thinking, Ace raised his hand and mentioned he'd been teaching himself guitar for the past year, learning Chuck Berry and Eddie Cochran songs by ear in his bedroom. Mrs. Kleinman's eyes had narrowed immediately. In her world, teaching yourself wasn't learning, it was just making noise without understanding music's foundation. Mr. Frehley, Mrs. Kleinman's voice cut through the classroom that Tuesday morning. I'd like you to bring your guitar to the front of the class, please. Ace's stomach dropped. His guitar was propped against his desk, a cheap Gretsch Corvette he'd bought for $47 from a pawn shop on Fordham Road. He hadn't planned on playing anything today. He'd brought it because he had band practice after school, and leaving a guitar at home in the Bronx was asking for it to disappear. The other kids turned in their seats, 30 pairs of eyes watching as Ace stood up, his face already burning. Being singled out by Mrs. Kleinman was never good. Ace walked to the front, carrying his guitar like it was evidence in a crime he didn't commit. Mrs. Kleinman stood with her arms crossed, her cat-eye glasses reflecting the overhead lights, her mouth set in that thin line that meant someone was about to get destroyed. Class, Mrs. Kleinman announced. I want to use Mr. Frehley as an example of something we've been discussing, the difference between real musicianship and what passes for music among young people today. If you're enjoying this story of how doubt became fuel for greatness, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. Before Ace could process what was happening, Mrs. Kleinman placed sheet music on a stand in front of him. Greensleeves. Every beginning student learns this piece. Surely someone who's been teaching himself for a year can sight-read basic notation. Ace looked at the sheet music like it was written in hieroglyphics. He knew Greensleeves by ear, but reading music? Nobody had taught him that. He learned by feel, by playing Chuck Berry riffs 500 times until his fingers remembered without thinking. I don't read music, ma'am, Ace said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't read music, Mrs. Kleinman repeated slowly, like explaining something to a small child. You've been playing guitar for a year, and you don't read music. Well then, why don't you play us something? Anything you want. Ace's hands were shaking as he pulled the strap over his shoulder. 30 kids were staring, waiting for him to fail, and Mrs. Kleinman was standing there with that look that said she already knew exactly what would happen. Ace closed his eyes and started playing the opening riff to Johnny B. Good. His fingers found the strings, muscle memory taking over, and for about 10 seconds, Ace forgot where he was. He forgot the classroom, forgot Mrs. Kleinman, forgot everything except the way Chuck Berry's guitar spoke a language that didn't need sheet music. His right hand dug into the strings with aggressive attack, his left hand bending the notes, making them cry the way they were supposed to. When Ace opened his eyes and stopped playing, the classroom was silent. For 3 seconds, he thought maybe he'd shown them something. Then Mrs. Kleinman started a slow, sarcastic clap. "Thank you, Mr. Frehley, for that demonstration. Class, pay attention, because Mr. Frehley has just provided a perfect example of what happens when someone tries to play music without proper foundation." Ace stood frozen as Mrs. Kleinman walked around him like he was an exhibit in a museum of failures. First, notice the complete absence of dynamic control. Everything at the same aggressive volume, no subtlety. Second, observe the sloppy technique, fingers all over the fretboard, creating unnecessary noise. Third, listen to what he chose to play. A 3-chord rock song that any monkey could learn by repetition. Each word landed like a punch. Ace kept his eyes down, his face burning. The guitar strap was cutting into his shoulder, but he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Mrs. Kleinman positioned herself directly in front of Ace, and when he looked up, her eyes held absolute certainty. "Mr. Frehley, I'm going to be very direct, because someone needs to tell you the truth. I've been teaching music for over 2 decades. I've seen hundreds of students. Some have genuine talent. Most don't. And you fall very clearly into the second category." The classroom was dead silent. This wasn't funny anymore. This was brutal. You have enthusiasm, I'll grant you that. But enthusiasm without discipline is worthless. Playing rock. Riffs in your bedroom isn't musicianship. It's noise. Your technique is fundamentally flawed. Your understanding of music theory is non-existent. And your choice of genre tells me you have no appreciation for real music. She turned to the class, using Ace as her teaching prop. "Mr. Frehley represents everything wrong with popular music today. No training, no discipline, no respect for the great composers, just 3 chords and an attitude." Mrs. Kleinman looked back at Ace one final time. "My advice to you is to give up this guitar fantasy before you waste years of your life. You don't have the discipline for serious music. You don't have the intelligence for theory. And you certainly don't have the talent to make any kind of living with a guitar. The sooner you accept reality, the better off you'll be. You may sit down now." Ace walked back to his desk, feeling like someone had torn something vital from his chest. Nobody looked at him. He sat down and stared at his guitar case for the remaining 37 minutes of class. Mrs. Kleinman's words echoing in his head. "You will never achieve anything with a guitar. Give up now before you waste years of your life." After the bell rang, Ace didn't go to his next class. He walked out of DeWitt Clinton, got on the BX-12 bus, and rode home to his family's apartment on Hutchinson Avenue. He went straight to his room, put his guitar in the closet, closed the door, and sat on his bed, staring at nothing. His mother, Esther Frehley, came home 2 hours later from her shift at the button factory. She found Ace still sitting there, and she knew immediately something was very wrong. "Paul, what happened?" Ace tried to hold it together. 15-year-old boys from the Bronx weren't supposed to cry. But when his mother sat beside him and put her hand on his shoulder, everything poured out. He told her about Mrs. Kleinman, about being made to play in front of the class, about being told he had no talent, about being used as an example of everything wrong. Esther listened, her face getting harder with each sentence. When Ace finished, she stood up with a look in her eyes he'd only seen a few times in his life. "Get your coat. We're going back to that school." They took the bus back to DeWitt Clinton. Esther marched straight to the principal's office with Ace trailing behind, mortified but also secretly grateful. Principal Matthew Rosenberg listened to Esther's furious account, nodded sympathetically, promised to speak with Mrs. Kleinman about classroom conduct, but gently suggested that perhaps Ace was being oversensitive, that constructive criticism was part of education. "That wasn't constructive," Esther said, her voice shaking with controlled rage. "That was humiliation. That was a teacher using authority to crush a child in front of his peers." Walking home, Esther put her arm around Ace's shoulders. "Listen to me, Paul. That woman doesn't know what she's talking about. She knows how to read sheet music. She knows how to teach kids to play like robots. But you know what she doesn't know? She doesn't know that the best music comes from the heart, not from paper. And she sure as hell doesn't know my son. You're going to prove her wrong." That night, Ace couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the humiliation, the laughter, Mrs. Kleinman's certainty that he would fail. But he also kept hearing his mother's words. Prove her wrong. Use it as fuel. Around 2 a.m, Ace got out of bed, opened his closet, and pulled out his Gretsch. He plugged into his small practice amp, turned the volume down low, and started playing. He played Chuck Berry riffs. He played Eddie Cochran licks. He played everything he knew, then tried to figure out new things, pushing his fingers to find sounds that were his own. The next day at school, Ace walked past Mrs. Kleinman in the hallway. She didn't acknowledge him, didn't even glance in his direction. He was already forgotten, just another failed student. But Ace looked at her and made a silent promise. One day, she would remember him. One day, she would know his name. Ace started practicing obsessively, 4 hours a day after school, 6 hours on weekends. His fingers developed calluses so thick they looked like armor. He joined every band that would have him, playing basement parties and school dances for $20 and free pizza. He practiced until his amp blew out. He practiced until his strings broke. He practiced until his fingers bled and his parents yelled at him to turn that noise down. And every single time he wanted to quit, every single time someone said his band wasn't good enough, Ace thought about Mrs. Kleinman telling him he'd never make it, and he thought, "Watch me." In 1973, Ace saw an ad in Rolling Stone, band-seeking guitarist, must have great gear and be able to play. Ace showed up to that audition at Gene Simmons's loft on 23rd Street with his Les Paul and Marshall amp, and he played like his life depended on it. He played with all the aggression Mrs. Kleinman had called worthless. He played with the sloppy technique she'd mocked. He played those 3-chord rock songs she'd dismissed. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley looked at each other. "Welcome to Kiss," Gene said. By 1975, Kiss was playing sold-out arenas. By 1976, they were on the cover of every rock magazine in America. And by 1977, Ace Frehley, the kid who couldn't read music, was recognized as one of the most influential rock guitarists of his generation. In January 1978, Ace walked into Electric Lady Studios to record his solo album. When New York Groove started climbing the charts that summer, becoming the biggest hit any Kiss member would ever have as a solo artist, one of the first things Ace thought about was Mrs. Kleinman. He wondered if she was still teaching. He wondered if she'd heard it on the radio. He wondered if she remembered the kid she'd humiliated 12 years earlier. In March 1979, Kiss played Madison Square Garden, 4 sold-out nights to over 80,000 people. The New York Daily News ran a feature about the Bronx kid who'd become a rock god. Several former teachers were quoted, all claiming they'd always known Paul Frehley had something special. Dorothy Kleinman was not among those quoted. But she read that article in her apartment, staring at a photo of Ace on stage in his space makeup, playing guitar in front of 20,000 screaming fans. And for the first time in her career, she felt something she'd never experienced. The sick realization that she'd been catastrophically wrong. 3 weeks later, Mrs. Kleinman wrote Ace a letter, sending it to Kiss's management in Los Angeles. In it, she apologized. She explained that she'd been teaching so long she'd become rigid, unable to recognize talent that didn't fit her narrow definition. She said watching his success had taught her more about music than 3 decades of teaching. Ace received the letter while on tour in Detroit. His road manager assumed he'd throw it away. Instead, Ace read it 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in his guitar case. 2 months later, Ace did something unexpected. He went back to DeWitt Clinton and asked to speak with Mrs. Kleinman. They met in her classroom after school, the same room where she'd destroyed a 15-year-old kid 13 years earlier. "Mrs. Kleinman, I got your letter," Ace said. "I wanted to thank you." She looked shocked. "Thank me?" "Yeah. What you did that day, it hurt like hell. But you gave me a choice. I could believe you or I could prove you wrong. And choosing to prove you wrong made me practice harder than I ever would have otherwise. Every time I wanted to quit, I thought about you telling me I'd never make it. And I thought, yeah? Watch this." Mrs. Kleinman had tears in her eyes. "I was wrong about you. About everything." "You weren't all wrong," Ace said. "I didn't have formal training. I couldn't read music. My technique was probably terrible by classical standards. You just didn't understand that those things weren't weaknesses. They were what made me different." The story became famous in New York music education circles. Mrs. Kleinman told it to her classes as a cautionary tale about being too rigid in definitions of talent. "I once had a student who didn't fit any of my categories. He couldn't read music. He had no formal training. His name was Ace Frehley, and he taught me that the greatest artists are often the ones who break all the rules we think matter." Ace kept Mrs. Kleinman's letter in his guitar case for years, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even people who hurt us can learn and grow, and that forgiveness requires more strength than holding a grudge. The music teacher made Ace Frehley stand in front of class and told him he'd never make it, that he was wasting his time, that he had no future with a guitar. What Ace did next wasn't just prove her wrong. He showed that students we dismiss might be the ones who redefine everything. He showed an entire generation that you don't need permission from authority figures to chase your dreams. And he showed that when someone tells you that you can't do something, that can become the fuel that drives you further than you ever imagined. If this story moved you, subscribe and share this video. Drop a comment if a teacher ever told you that you wouldn't succeed. Sometimes the best response to doubt isn't anger. It's persistence, success, and eventually, grace.